She was only 16, crowned against her will, imprisoned by her cousin, and led to the scaffold with trembling steps. But it wasn't the axe that made Lady Jane Grey's execution horrifying. It was what she said before it fell, and what went terribly wrong the moment she blindly stepped toward death. Lady Jane Grey was born into ambition, not her own, but that of others, born in October 1537. Just 2 days before Prince Edward, the long-awaited son of Henry VIII, Jane entered the world. With noble blood, royal connections, and a future that would be shaped not by fate, but by greed. Her parents, Lady Frances Brandon and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, were hungry for power, and Jane, a quiet, brilliant girl with sharp wit and devout Protestant faith, became their most valuable piece on the chessboard. She was no ordinary child. By the age of 10, Jane could read Greek and Latin, and she devoured theological texts with a hunger that shocked even her tutors. Her letters reveal a girl deeply pious, firm in belief, and startlingly mature for her age. But intelligence was not a shield. It was bait for those who saw in Jane a blank canvas upon which they could draw their own ambitions. At the heart of those ambitions was religion. The Protestant Reformation had fractured England. Under Henry VIII, the break from Rome was political. Under Edward VI, it was spiritual. Jane, raised in this Protestant crucible, became a symbol of purity and reform, a perfect figurehead, a pliable queen. By 1553, King Edward VI was dying, only 15, childless, and with no surviving brothers. His death threatened to undo everything Protestant reformers had built. His half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, was next in line. And to the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, that was unacceptable. He needed a Protestant queen. He needed someone young, malleable, and royal by blood. He needed Jane, and so, in a ruthless stroke of political theater, Jane was married off to Dudley's son, Guildford. She was then presented with a document declaring her the rightful heir to the throne. Jane reportedly resisted. She wept. She argued. But in the end, she signed. On July 10, 1553, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England. She was 16 years old. She had never sought the crown. She had not schemed for it, fought for it, or asked for it. But now it sat on her head, cold and Farna, crown made of lead more than gold. She ruled from the Tower of London, not from a palace. She never held a coronation. She never commanded an army. Her rule existed only on parchment, in proclamations read aloud in trembling voices. Because just 9 days later, everything collapsed. Mary Tudor had not disappeared. She rallied support from East Anglia, riding with strength, determination, and a deeply rooted belief in her right. The people, many still loyal to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, flocked to her cause. Within days, Mary's forces overwhelmed Jane's fragile regime. Jane was arrested. She and Guildford were taken as prisoners, not traitors yet, but disposable inconveniences. Mary, now queen, showed mercy at first. She seemed willing to let Jane live, viewing her as an innocent pawn. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower, the same place she had once ruled from as queen. Her chambers became her cell. She wrote letters, read her Bible, and awaited judgment. For a moment, there was hope. Perhaps Mary would spare her. But hope, in Tudor England, had a cruel tendency to rot from the inside. And in the days to come, as rebellion stirred outside the Tower walls, that fragile hope would curdle into something far more terrifying, something that would end not in mercy, but in trembling footsteps toward a scaffold no girl should ever have known. In early 1554, just months after her brief reign, Jane Grey sat behind stone walls, still cloaked in uncertainty, though no longer called queen. She was still a symbol, one that could either be pitied or eliminated, depending on the winds of politics. Queen Mary Tudor, newly crowned and pressured by her counselors, hesitated to execute the girl many still saw as innocent. But mercy had an enemy far more persuasive than justice: fear. That fear exploded with Wyatt's rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant noble, led a revolt against Mary's plan to marry Philip II of Spain. The people, weary of a Catholic monarch aligning with Spanish power, rallied to his cause, though Jane had no part in the uprising. Her name was whispered in every corner of the rebellion. Would she be restored? Would Protestantism rise again through her blood? It didn't matter that Jane never left her cell to marry. Jane was no longer a person, she was a threat, and worse, an icon. Wyatt's rebellion was crushed, but in its ashes rose a chilling conclusion. Jane Grey could no longer be allowed to live. The death warrant was signed on February 7, 1505 for It arrived without ceremony. Jane, ever composed, received the news with a strange calm. She had known this day might come, but knowing it and walking toward it were not the same. She was told she had 3 days to prepare her soul. She spent those days in prayer. She read from the book of Psalms. She wrote letters of forgiveness, of courage, of unshakable belief. In one of her final messages, she wrote, "If justice is done with my body, my soul will find mercy with God." Her words were not those of a frightened girl, but of someone who had already begun to see herself as separate from the world's cruelty. Her husband, Guildford Dudley, was also sentenced to die. Jane requested to see him one last time. Mary refused, and so Jane would never again speak to the boy she was forced to marry, the boy who, like her, had been pushed into a throne he never asked for. On the morning of February 12th, the tower was cloaked in a gray mist. Jane awoke at dawn, dressed herself in black, and took a final walk with her gentlewoman. She passed the execution site prepared for Guildford. Hours earlier, he had been led from his cell, pale and shaking, toward Tower Hill, where the axe fell before a silent crowd. His body, bloodied and broken, was carted past Jane's window on the way to his grave. She saw it. She did not look away. And then she was summoned. The scaffold had been constructed within the tower walls, an attempt by Mary to avoid turning Jane into a martyr. It was a smaller audience, but no less grave. Jane mounted the steps with slow, measured dignity. A slight breeze stirred her veil. In her arms, she clutched her prayer book, worn from days of study. She turned to the small crowd and spoke, "I am come hither to die. I am a Christian woman. I do not look to be saved by any other means, but only by the mercy of God and the blood of His only Son, Jesus Christ." There were no pleas, no screams, no final protest. But what came next would sear itself into memory, not for what she said, but for what she could not see. Because as Jane knelt, blindfolded, in the center of that scaffold, she reached out for the execution block and found nothing. Her hands grasped at empty air. Her voice trembled. "What shall I do? Where is it?" She could not find the block, and in that moment, everything, faith, nobility, preparation, collapsed into raw, human fear. It would be the hands of a stranger that finally guided her to her end, and what followed would prove that history's clean retellings were merciful lies. The crowd hushed as Lady Jane Grey fumbled forward, hands stretched into void, her breath caught. The blindfold pressed too tightly, shrouding her in shadow. The wooden scaffold creaked beneath her as the moment unraveled. This was not the composed death of a queen. It was something far more human and far more horrifying. Jane's fingers trembled, groping across splintered wood. Somewhere, only feet away, the executioner stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. The soldiers shifted. Uncomfortably, time slowed. And then came her soft, cracking plea, "What shall I do? Where is it?" This was not the glorious end that some might have imagined for the 9 days queen. This was not regal nor dignified. It was raw, a blindfolded child, 16 years old, searching for the place where she would die. She had spent her final days preparing her soul for martyrdom, but nothing could prepare her for this moment of helplessness. A bystander finally stepped forward, perhaps the lieutenant of the tower or a gentlewoman. Accounts vary, and guided Jane's hands to the block. She lowered herself with care, pressing her cheek against the coarse surface, her breathing shallow, her lips still whispering prayers. "I commend my soul to God," she murmured. "Lord, into thy hands I commit my spirit." The headsman, masked and waiting, raised the axe. The blade fell once. The sound was not thunderous, it was soft, thick, final. Jane's body slumped forward, still cloaked in black. The prayer book had slipped from her grasp. A pool of red spread across the pale boards of the scaffold. No cheers, no jeers, just stunned silence. Even the wind, it seemed, had gone still. she was buried within the Tower of London, not far from the woman whose son had condemned her, Anne Boleyn. In the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the remains of queens and traitors lie side by side. Jane's name was not carved in grandeur. Her grave was marked only later, modest and austere. But in death, her story had only begun. For centuries, Jane Grey would be mythologized, sanctified, and sometimes politicized. Some saw her as a Protestant martyr, the girl who died for her faith. Others viewed her as a victim of dynastic games, a tragic emblem of innocence caught in a web of ambition. Few looked past the iconography to see the human cost, the agony not of political failure, but of a death sentence carried out with trembling hands. Her execution, often portrayed as serene and brave, had been fractured by terror and confusion. The moment she lost the block beneath her fingers revealed the truth, that no amount of learning, piety, or nobility could make dying any easier. Her poise had broken at the last second, not because she lacked courage, but because she was still just a girl. The Tower of London would see many more deaths, some infamous, some forgotten. But the horror of Jane's execution endured not because of gore or spectacle, but because it revealed the fragility behind the weight of royal dignity. Her final act wasn't a speech, it was a question whispered into the silence. And that whisper would echo across generations. Even today, standing at the scaffold site, visitors speak of a chill that runs deeper than mere history. They speak of a presence young, intelligent, frightened, reaching out into the darkness, asking not for salvation, but simply to be shown the place where it all ends. But Jane's death was not the last cruelty inflicted by her legacy, because soon, another woman, one even closer to Mary Tudor's bloodline, would be forced to wear the crown and carry the weight of Jane's ghost into her own horrifying fate. Jane Grey's execution did not purify the throne, it poisoned it. The blade may have silenced her voice, but it unleashed a storm within the soul of Mary Tudor, a queen now ruled as much by guilt as by fire. As Jane's blood sank into the scaffold's grain, a new chapter of torment began, this time under a crown worn by Mary herself. Mary had inherited more than just the throne. She had inherited a nation fractured by religious violence, scarred by civil unrest, and haunted by the whisper of Protestant resistance. Jane Grey had been a puppet, but her death transformed her into something far more dangerous, a Protestant martyr. The people who had once cheered for Mary now watched her with suspicion, wondering how far she would go to silence dissent. And Mary went far. In her quest to restore Catholicism to England, Queen Mary launched one of the most brutal campaigns of religious persecution in English history. Hundreds of Protestant bishops, clergymen, and commoners were rounded up and burned alive for heresy. The flames that consumed them earned Mary her infamous title, Bloody Mary. But even as she ruled with holy vengeance, Mary remained haunted by one figure, Elizabeth, her half-sister, her rival, her next potential threat. Elizabeth Tudor was everything Jane Grey had been: educated, noble, Protestant, but with something Jane never had, a legitimate claim to the throne. Daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, Elizabeth had survived her mother's execution and her own branding as a bastard. Now, with Jane dead and Mary ruling alone, Elizabeth became both a shadow and a mirror representing the future Mary feared, and the youth she had lost. Mary's health began to fail just 2 years after Jane's death. Tormented by phantom pregnancies and mounting paranoia, she drifted further into isolation. Her Spanish husband, Philip II, was often absent. Her people grew restless, and Elizabeth, kept under careful watch, became the silent center of every court whisper. Was she plotting? Would she rise, as Jane nearly had? Mary had once imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower, the very same walls that had swallowed Jane whole. Elizabeth's life hung in the balance, but unlike Jane, she had learned to play the long game. She spoke carefully, she complied, she smiled when needed, and vanished when not. She survived, and when Mary Tudor finally died in November 1558, after a reign marked by executions and miscarried dreams, Elizabeth became queen. It was a moment the world had been waiting for and dreading, a Protestant monarch returning to power in the very place where her cousin had bled for the same cause. But Elizabeth's rise did not come with cheers alone. It came with ghosts. Chief among them was Jane Grey. In private, Elizabeth spoke rarely of Jane, but her reign meticulously crafted, fiercely independent, and often unforgiving reflected a woman who had seen what the crown could do. She knew that Jane's downfall had not been caused by weakness, but by trust in family. In politics, in mercy. Elizabeth trusted no one. And for good reason. Because even as the Virgin Queen built her golden court, commissioned her dazzling portraits, and reformed her country, the shadow of Jane's scaffold never left her mind. It wasn't just that Elizabeth remembered Jane. It was that she remembered what it felt like to stand next in line to the axe. But her survival would come at a price, one that would echo in every decision, every alliance denied, every execution ordered. And as Elizabeth's own hands became stained with the burden of power, the ghost of Jane Grey would remind her what happened to women who wore the crown too lightly. Elizabeth Tudor ruled with brilliance, but she also ruled with memory, and the memory that haunted her most deeply was that of Lady Jane Grey. Though Jane had been dead for years by the time Elizabeth ascended the throne, her presence lingered, like a quiet echo behind every decision the new queen made. Jane had been cautious, composed, obedient, and still she had been destroyed. Elizabeth, then, would be none of those things. She would not be used as a pawn. She would not marry to please advisers, and she would not name a successor who might rise before her death. Every misstep that had doomed Jane became a warning carved into Elizabeth's core. And yet, in her efforts to outmaneuver death, Elizabeth often became just as ruthless as the world that killed her cousin. She never pardoned those who questioned her legitimacy. She sent Mary, Queen of Scots, another cousin, another rival to her own execution decades later, and she left no heir. Refusing to share power with husband or child, it was not merely strategy, it was trauma. The throne had nearly killed her before she ever wore it. She learned that crowns come not with safety, but with sharpening blades, and Jane was always the first cut. But Jane's legacy was not confined to Elizabeth's conscience. In the eyes of the public, Jane became something else entirely, a symbol, a martyr, a teenage saint of the Protestant cause. Writers, both Catholic and Protestant, began to shape her image to suit their needs. Some painted her as a pious victim, others as a tragic heroine, and a few even accused her of ambition. But no version fully captured the horror of what she had actually endured. Perhaps that's why Elizabeth never publicly honored Jane, never gave her a monument, never spoke her name in speeches, because to speak of Jane was to unearth the reality behind the myth that England's most innocent queen had been consumed by the very machine Elizabeth herself now controlled. The Tower of London, once Jane's prison, then her grave became a center of royal ceremony again. But the stones remembered, so did the people. Visitors to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula began to ask where the 9 days queen was buried. They wanted to stand over the bones of the girl who had ruled from duty, not desire. The girl who had walked up the scaffold and asked, blindly, where her death was waiting. But there was no statue, no tomb with carved letters. Just a name added centuries later to a shared slab of stone. Jane, Guildford, and Boleyn, Catherine Howard queens and queens in waiting, all lost to history's cruelty, stacked beneath the floor of a silent chapel. Elizabeth's reign would become one of the most celebrated in English history. She would defeat the Spanish Armada, inspire the age of Shakespeare, and forge a national identity. But none of it erased the moment she, too, had been led into the Tower, fearing she might never emerge. And in that memory, Lady Jane Grey waited, not as a political tool, not as a saint, but as a mirror. Elizabeth survived where Jane had not, but survival had its own cost, and the longer Elizabeth ruled, the more she understood that power, especially for a woman, was always balanced on a blade's edge. Because what had happened to Jane could happen again, and this time the executioner would not wait for permission. Lady Jane Grey's physical body was buried beneath the cold stones of the Tower Chapel, but her death would not stay confined to the vaults of history. In the decades and centuries that followed, she began to reemerge not through official ceremony or royal proclamation, but through rumor, reflection, and the haunting need for meaning. The girl who ruled for 9 days became larger in death than she ever was in life. Writers began to whisper her name again in the 17th and 18th centuries. In an England that had changed monarchs, religions, and empires, Jane became a blank canvas on which moralists, artists, and theologians could paint their visions of innocence, piety, and sacrifice. In Protestant sermons, she was the Tudor saint, a girl martyred for the true faith. In romantic poetry, she became the ethereal queen whose crown was forged in tragedy. But the truth, as always, was more jagged. The real Jane Grey was neither saint nor schemer. She was a girl trapped by ambition, crushed by politics, and remembered more for how she died than for how she lived. And yet that was precisely why her legacy endured. Her story served as a parable not of triumph, but of warning that virtue does not protect the powerless, that crowns can strangle, and that in England, even the young could be led to execution without protest. In the Victorian era, Jane's image was further sanctified. Artists like Paul Delaroche painted her as the ultimate tragic heroine, eyes closed, arms outstretched, dressed in white, led gently toward the block. But these portrayals, though beautiful, softened the truth. They removed the trembling hands, the blindfolded confusion, the whispered plea in search of the block. They buried the panic and preserved only the pose. And yet, beneath the romantic layers, the rawness of Jane's fate continued to echo, especially in the minds of women. As women in later centuries began to fight for education, agency, and voice, they found in Jane a complicated symbol. A girl who had been brilliantly educated far beyond what was typical for her gender and time. Only to have that brilliance used against her, her learning became a justification for the crown. Her obedience made her the perfect candidate for manipulation, and her silence, in the end, ensured her death. To the women of the Enlightenment and beyond, Jane Grey embodied a fundamental tension, that intelligence and virtue in a woman could be both prized and punished. Modern historians now seek to untangle the myth from the reality. They pore through her letters, examine accounts of her execution, and question the political narratives that followed her death. They ask, who really made Jane queen? Was she truly unwilling, or simply bound by duty to object? And was her death necessary or merely convenient? But no amount of analysis can erase the image seared into the historical conscience. A 16-year-old girl, blindfolded and alone, asking the most human question imaginable. Where is it? That question echoes still, not just in the stone walls of the tower, but in classrooms, in courtrooms, in quiet corners of museums. Her story forces us to ask what power really protects and whom it sacrifices when threatened. The tragedy of Jane Grey is not only that she died, but that so many like her would come after. And the most terrifying truth, England had not finished creating queens it would later destroy. Lady Jane Grey was not the last queen England betrayed. Her death carved a mold one into which history would press new names, new faces, new tragedies. Because once the axe falls for one girl, it becomes easier to raise it for another. The scaffold, once stained, rarely stays dry. In the century following Jane's execution, England would send more queens to the block. Many bore crowns briefly, all bore guilt they often didn't earn. And Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Mary, Queen of Scots, the monarchy, while draped in pageantry, often cloaked its cruelty in whispers of treason and threats of betrayal. But it was always the same story, a woman surrounded by men, sacrificed when her existence became inconvenient. What made Jane's execution more horrifying than many was not just her age. It was her irrelevance to the chaos that consumed her. She held no real power. She made no military move. Her crown was ceremonial, her rule theoretical. And yet she died all the same, because her name could be used and therefore had to be removed. In Mary, Queen of Scots, we see a cruel parallel. Another young queen, crowned early and ensnared in politics she couldn't control. Mary Stuart's downfall came not from rebellion, but from being too royal for her cousin Elizabeth's comfort. After decades of imprisonment, she too was led to execution. She too wore fine fabric, made a final prayer, and bowed her head not in defeat, but in weary resolution. Even centuries later, the echoes of Jane's fate could still be heard in the stories of royal women forced into public lives and punished for private complications, Queen Caroline of Brunswick publicly humiliated. Princess Diana chased into death by a crown that no longer protected her. Meghan Markle exiled by a machine that devours those who don't fit. The horror is not just that Jane died, but that her story became a template. And that template, while altered by time, still haunts every woman born near the throne. And what of the place where it all began? The Tower of London remains now a monument, a tourist destination, a museum. But beneath the armored displays and crown jewels, the stone remembers. Visitors walk past the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula unaware that beneath their feet lie the bones of Jane, Anne, and Catherine. No statues mark their final rest. No great tombs tell their stories. Only names on plaques, sanded down by time, tucked away from the pomp of Westminster. The tower tries to forget, but history never does. And so Lady Jane Grey remains, the girl who should never have worn the crown, the queen who ruled for 9 days, and the child who died with a prayer on her lips and no one beside her. Her tragedy wasn't just that she died, but that her death meant so little to the world that demanded it. But in the silence that followed the fall of the axe, something changed. For those who would come after her, those who would write, teach, and remember, Jane became something no executioner could cut down, a warning. Because behind every queen's coronation is a shadow of a block. Behind every royal vow, a silent echo of a whispered plea. Where is it? And in that single, shaking sentence, blindfolded, breathless, Jane Grey spoke not just for herself, but for every woman history would pretend to crown, only to later crush. Lady Jane Grey's story should have ended on that scaffold in 1554, but instead, it endured. Not just in history books, but in England's psyche as an open wound, unhealed and quietly aching. She died voiceless, powerless, and blindfolded. But the silence she left behind became louder with time. Across centuries, generations kept returning to her, not to mourn a queen, but to confront a nation's conscience. It's tempting to frame Jane as a symbol of martyrdom, a pure Protestant sacrificed on the altar of political ambition, and in many versions of her tale, that's exactly how she appears: devout, angelic, betrayed. But that version, while comforting, also strips her of what made her human. Jane was not born to be an idea. She was a girl who studied, wrote, loved, and prayed. She had dreams that reached beyond her 9 days as queen, and she had fears that no execution sermon could sanctify away. What makes her death so disturbing isn't simply the injustice, it's how ordinary the injustice was. Her life was valued only when it served a purpose. Once that purpose ended, so did her protection. And this quiet disposal of a teenage girl was done not in secret, but in the full view of a watching world. Jane's memory continues to haunt not because she was exceptional, but because she was expendable. Her death reminds us that even intelligence, virtue, and obedience offer no defense when power decides it is done with you. And England knew it. That's why Jane's ghost lived on, not as a supernatural specter, but as a moral reckoning. In every era that followed, artists, authors, and reformers invoked her name. During the English Civil War, her story was used to condemn tyranny. In the Enlightenment, she became a muse for poets who saw her as the ultimate victim of patriarchal politics. In Victorian England, school children learned her virtues alongside their Bible verses, and in the modern age, feminist scholars unearthed her again not as a saint, but as a teenager cornered by a system that demanded perfection, then punished her for it. Her words, especially those written in the final days of her life, remain chillingly composed. They show a mind still reaching for understanding, still wrestling with the meaning of death, still trying to make peace with a world that had used her up. That calmness, often mistaken for acceptance, was something else entirely: clarity. Jane knew she would be remembered. She just didn't know how. And perhaps that's the final horror, that her legacy would be shaped by others, by those who never stood on the scaffold with her, who never felt the blindfold, who never had to search for the block. Even now, tourists visit the Tower of London, gaze at the green where she was killed, and move on. Some know her name, most do not. But beneath that patch of grass, beneath the glass markers and solemn signs, still rests a girl who once ruled a kingdom in name alone and paid for it. With everything. The story of Lady Jane Grey isn't just a tragedy. It is a lesson written in blood, buried under stone, and carried forward not by power, but by those willing to remember what power once destroyed. And so, her voice remains not in royal proclamations, but in the soft, persistent echo that history cannot silence, the echo that reminds us what happens when a crown is placed on the wrong head, and the executioner is already waiting behind the throne. In the centuries after Lady Jane Grey's execution, her story became more than a tale of politics. It became a symbol of all that was broken in the machinery of monarchy. Her life, barely lived, became a ledger of regrets, unspoken truths, and the cruelty of decorum. The girl who had ruled for 9 days left behind no heir, no palace, and no triumph, but she did leave behind a silence so profound that it swallowed every justification made on her behalf. That silence was passed down not as words, but as example. In every royal woman who followed, especially those closest to the throne, Jane's shadow crept quietly behind them. It reminded them that to be royal and female was to walk a line so thin it could cut. Elizabeth I knew this, and Boleyn died knowing it. Mary, Queen of Scots, ignored it and paid the price. And long after the Tudors were gone, Jane's presence still flickered in the lives of queens who had come under fire, not for what they did, but for what they represented. Because Jane's greatest crime, in the eyes of power, wasn't rebellion. It was existing. She existed as a reminder of uncertainty, a living crack in the carefully constructed facade of royal legitimacy, a Protestant when England needed unity, a cousin with just enough blood to be dangerous. Her execution wasn't about justice, it was about removing a symbol that made rulers nervous. And the message was heard loud and clear: crowns may be offered, but they are never free. Even centuries later, when monarchies softened and the scaffold was replaced by scandal, Jane's story lingered like a quiet accusation. Queen Victoria named her youngest daughter Helena Jane in modern Britain. Scholars teach her life alongside those of Elizabeth and Mary. Her face, captured in paintings imagined long after her death, continues to haunt classrooms and bookshelves. But Jane herself remains a mystery. No portrait painted during her lifetime survives. No lock of her hair, no personal diary. What we know of her comes from letters, second-hand accounts, and the memories of those who may have loved her or used her. She is both real and unreal, solid in death, but blurred in life, and perhaps that's the truest mark of what was done to her. Jane Grey was a girl who had no chance to define herself. Her voice was smothered beneath the needs of others. Her faith was wielded as weaponry by those who never cared what she believed. Her name became a rallying cry for movements she never chose. She was, in every sense, the crown's casualty. Yet the silence she left behind grew louder with each retelling. And today, that silence demands a reckoning, because every society that builds idols from innocence must eventually confront what it destroys. To maintain the illusion, Jane was not a ruler, not a reformer, not a martyr by choice. She was a girl in the wrong place, at the wrong time, carrying the weight of decisions she never made. And in remembering her, not just the queen, but the child, the scholar, the girl, we confront the deeper question her life poses. How many others have we forgotten? How many stories like Jane's, soft-spoken, unrecorded, discarded, have vanished into the margins? The Tower of London may hold her bones, but the true weight of Jane Grey lies not in her grave. It lies in the silence of every voice we never let speak. And in that silence, the final part of her story waits. The Tower of London looms with centuries of memory, but none more quietly devastating than the memory of Lady Jane Grey. Tourists pass through its iron gates daily, guided by yeoman warders in costume. Surrounded by polished stone and manicured lawns, they photograph the ravens, peer at the crown jewels, and listen to tales of ancient kings. Few linger at the small chapel hidden behind its fortress walls. Fewer still know what lies beneath their feet. In the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, plain and cold, the remains of Lady Jane Grey lie somewhere beneath the stone floor named for centuries, buried alongside her husband, Guildford Dudley, and the countless others sacrificed on the altar of political survival. There's no grand tomb, no crown, no inscription carved by royal hand, just a marker added long after her death, and the quiet creak of wooden pews above her dot. She was England's shortest reigning monarch, yet her legacy outlasted kings and queens who ruled for decades. But why? Because Jane's story cuts deeper than coronations or confessions of faith. It exposes the machinery of power, the cold, calculated indifference of those who saw a child not as a person, but as a solution. When England needed a Protestant figurehead, she was summoned. When that figurehead became inconvenient, she was erased. And yet, she refused to disappear. Across paintings, literature, and folklore, Jane's image lingers like fog over the Thames. She is often imagined in white, symbol of purity, victimhood, and youth. But the real Jane was never given the luxury of being purely anything. She was learned, brave, and devout, but also terrified, blindfolded, and lost in the most critical moment of her life. Her calmness was not strength, it was resignation. And even now, we misremember her. We make her symbolic. We strip away her confusion. We wrap her in virtue, because it is easier to forgive a tragedy when the victim never raised their voice. But Jane did speak, in her letters, in her final words, in her stunned question on the scaffold. What shall I do? Those words should haunt us. They should echo every time we ask how a society justifies sacrificing its daughters to preserve its institutions. Jane was not unique in her fate, only in how young and publicly she met it. Throughout history, women were crowned for convenience and discarded for strategy. And when their stories threatened the comfort of national myth, they were softened into symbols or erased altogether. Jane Grey became both. But beneath every revision, the truth pulses. England killed a 16-year-old girl to send a message. And the message was heard. It was heard in the Tower, where Elizabeth Tudor was once imprisoned, haunted by her cousin's fate. It was heard in the marriage negotiations Elizabeth would forever refuse. It was heard in the silent tears of Mary, Queen of Scots, waiting in captivity for her own turn at the block. And it is heard today in the uneasy glances of those who read Jane's story and realize it is not about a queen, but a caution. Power does not apologize. It does not mourn. It merely survives. But people remember, and perhaps that's where the horror truly lies, not just in the acts, but in the fact that we allowed it, that we called it necessary, that we moved on. Lady Jane Grey's execution was not just a historical footnote. It was a moment that pulled back the veil on monarchy itself, for the pageantry, the divine right, the embroidered gowns. None of it shielded her from the truth. A crown cannot protect. A title cannot save. And when power feels threatened, innocence is often the first to fall. She ruled for 9 days. She died in less than 9 seconds. But her silence stretched for centuries. And somewhere, beneath the chapel floor, England's forgotten queen still waits, not for justice, not for redemption, but simply for the world to tell the truth about what was done in her name.